That changed sooner than I expected. And honestly, looking back, there were signs the whole time. I just wasn't looking in the right direction. One Friday, R brought donuts in like he always did. I remember grabbing one and sitting at my desk, scrolling through yet another collections notice on my phone, and he leaned over and asked what was going on. I told him, half joking, half exhausted. Somebody out there is living my entire life better than I am, apparently. They've got a nicer car and a nicer apartment than I do. He laughed. He said something like, "Man, that's rough. People are sick, dude," and went back to his desk. I think about that moment a lot now. It wasn't until about 3 months later that I found the first real clue, and it came from somewhere I never expected. It wasn't until about 3 months later that I found the first real clue, and it came from somewhere I never expected. I was at my mom's house for Sunday dinner, and I was venting to her about the whole situation, same as I'd been doing for months at that point. My mom, who is not exactly tech-savvy, but has more common sense than most people I know, asked me a question that genuinely stopped me in my tracks. She said, "Have you checked if any of these accounts have an email attached to them that isn't yours?" I hadn't even thought of that. I'd been so focused on disputing charges and proving fraud that I never stopped to look at the actual account details on these fraudulent accounts. What email was used, what phone number, what secondary address. I figured the credit bureaus and banks had that information locked down somewhere I couldn't access, or that it would all just say fraudulent, unauthorized, and nothing more specific. I was wrong. The very next day, I called the company that had issued the car loan. After explaining my situation for the 100th time, I asked the rep directly, "Can you tell me what email address is on file for this account?" She wasn't supposed to give me that information directly, technically, but after I explained I was the actual identity theft victim and provided my police report number, she read it to me. The email was something like r.designs.holdings@afreeemailprovider.com. Not my email, obviously, but something about the format made my stomach turn. R, the first letter of my coworker's first name, and holdings, which, now that I thought about it, sounded eerily similar to the name of a side business R used to talk about at work. He was always going on about wanting to start an LLC, some vague consulting or holdings company, get into real estate, build passive income. Half the office had heard him talk about it at one point or another. We all kind of nodded along the way you do when a coworker talks about a get-rich plan you don't think is actually going to happen. I told myself I was being paranoid. R.designs.holdings. It could be anyone. It could be a coincidence. I didn't want to accuse a guy I'd worked next to for 2 years of literally destroying my financial life based on 3 letters and an email address. But I couldn't let it go either. That night, I did something I probably should have done 8 months earlier. I went digging. I pulled up R's public social media. Nothing crazy, just looking at what was already out there for anyone to see. And on his Instagram, buried about 40 weeks back in his post history, there was a photo. A car. A black SUV. Posted with the caption something like, "Blessed. New whip." I recognized the model immediately, because I had been staring at the exact same model and year on my fraudulent credit report for months. I went back and compared the dates. The Instagram post was from 4 days after the fraudulent car loan was opened in my name. My hands were actually shaking at this point. I kept scrolling. There was a post from a few months later, a photo from what looked like a new apartment, modern kitchen, big windows. The caption something about, "Finally got my own place. Feels good to start fresh." I pulled up the fraudulent apartment lease paperwork I'd gotten from the property management company during my dispute process. Same city, same general area based on the building style in the photo. I couldn't prove it was the exact same apartment from a photo alone, but the timing, again, lined up almost perfectly with when that lease was opened in my name. I sat there at like 1 a.m. with my laptop, just staring at the screen, feeling this mix of nausea and rage and disbelief that I genuinely don't have words for. Because up until that point, some part of me had been holding on to this idea that whoever did this to me was some faceless criminal, some stranger, Some organized fraud operation working off a leaked database somewhere. That feels almost easier to process. It's random. It's not personal. But this? If this was really R, this was personal. This was someone who sat 2 cubicles away from me. Someone who brought donuts on Fridays. Someone who asked me how I was holding up while my life fell apart, knowing the entire time that he was the one tearing it down. I didn't sleep that night. I went into work the next morning and I genuinely don't know how I functioned. I remember sitting at my desk, watching him from the corner of my eye, watching him laugh at something on his phone, watching him get up and grab a coffee from the break room like everything was completely normal. And I just kept thinking, does he know that I know? Has he been waiting for this moment? Or does he genuinely not think I'll ever figure it out? I didn't confront him right away. I know some people reading this are going to think that was a mistake, that I should have gone straight to his desk and said something. But I'd already learned, through 8 brutal months of dealing with banks and credit bureaus, that emotions don't fix fraud. Evidence does. If I confronted him with nothing but a hunch based on an email prefix and some Instagram posts, he'd deny everything, delete his social media, cover his tracks even further, and I'd have lost the one real lead I had. So instead, I went home that night and I started building a case. Quietly, methodically. I screenshotted everything on his Instagram before he could delete it. The SUV post, the apartment post, a handful of others that lined up suspiciously well with other fraudulent accounts on my credit report. I pulled every piece of documentation I had on the 11 fraudulent accounts and laid them out next to the timeline of his social media activity. I requested official account opening documents from 2 of the creditors, which, as the verified victim, I was legally entitled to under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. Documents that included IP addresses used to apply for the accounts. That was the part that changed everything.
One of the IP addresses matched the public Wi-Fi network at our office. Not just an office somewhere, our specific company's guest Wi-Fi network. The one we all use to connect our personal phones during lunch breaks because the building had terrible cell signal. Someone had applied for a fraudulent credit card in my name using our office's Wi-Fi. I went back through my work calendar to check who was even in the office that day. I was not. I had taken a half a day for a doctor's appointment. R's timesheet, which I obviously didn't have direct access to, but which I later learned through the investigation, showed he'd clocked in the entire day. At that point, I wasn't dealing with a hunch anymore. I had a real, documented timeline-based case, and I knew exactly what I had to do next. But it wasn't going to be a conversation. It was going to be a police report with R's name on it. At that point, I wasn't dealing with a hunch anymore. I had a real, documented, timeline-based case, and I knew exactly what I had to do next. I called the detective who had been assigned to my original identity theft case, a guy I'd spoken to maybe twice over the course of 8 months, mostly just to get case number updates that went nowhere. I told him I had new information, significant new information. He asked me to come in. I brought everything. The folder that had been growing on my kitchen table for the better part of a year. Every collection notice, every dispute letter, every fraudulent account document I'd been able to obtain. And on top of all of that, I brought the screenshots, the IP address documentation, the timeline I'd built connecting R's social media activity to the opening dates of every fraudulent account. I laid it all out on the detective's desk and walked him through it piece by piece. He was quiet for a long time when I finished. And then he said, "You did more investigative work here than most victims ever do." I didn't know whether to feel proud of that or deeply sad about it. He told me they would open a formal investigation. He told me not to confront R directly, not to tip him off, not to change my behavior at work in any way that might signal something was happening. Just go in, do my job, act normal. Let them work. That was one of the hardest things I have ever been asked to do. For the next 3 weeks, I went into that office every single day and sat within 30 feet of the man who I believed had stolen my identity. run up nearly $80,000 in fraudulent debt in my name, destroyed my credit, cost me an apartment I'd wanted, and spent almost a year sitting next to me asking how I was doing about it. I smiled when he made jokes. I nodded when he talked. Once, he asked me if there was any update on my identity theft situation, and I said, "Still working through it." And he shook his head and said, "Man, that's brutal. I'm sorry." And I just said, "Yeah, it is what it is," and turned back to my computer screen. I don't know how I held it together. Honestly, I don't. I think by that point, I had been running on adrenaline and controlled anger for so long that I'd almost forgotten what calm felt like. Then, on a Tuesday morning about 3.5 weeks into the investigation, two things happened almost simultaneously. The first, I got a call from the detective at 8:47 a.m. telling me they had obtained a warrant and were moving forward. He said they had confirmed the IP address evidence, obtained phone records showing R had called 3 of the fraudulent creditors from his personal cell number, including one call made the same day I was on a lunch break venting to him about how many collection calls I was getting, and had identified the physical address tied to the fraudulent apartment lease as a unit R had been living in under a different arrangement. He asked me to please stay home from work that day if I could manage it. The second thing, R texted me at 9:03 a.m. asking if I wanted to do a lunch run. I never responded to that text. I sat in my apartment with my phone in my hand, reading it over and over, unable to fully process the fact that at some point that morning, possibly at the exact moment he was texting me about lunch, there were detectives preparing to show up at his door. R was arrested that afternoon. I found out through a coworker who called me, completely stunned, saying there had been police at the office and R had been walked out. I didn't say much on that call. I think I said something like, "Wow," and "Thanks for letting me know," and hung up and just sat there in silence for a while. I want to be honest about what that moment felt like, because I think people expect it to feel like relief, like a switch flipping, like the credits rolling at the end of a movie. It didn't feel like that. Not immediately. It felt strange, almost hollow, because the arrest didn't give me my credit score back. It didn't erase the 11 fraudulent accounts. It didn't return the hundreds of hours I'd spent on hold, or the apartment I didn't get, or the sleep I didn't have, or the weight I'd lost, or the way this whole ordeal had quietly eaten into every corner of my life for almost 2 years. What the arrest did was confirm what I already knew, that it was real, that I hadn't been paranoid, that it had been him the whole time. The legal process moved faster than I expected after that. R was charged with multiple counts of identity theft, wire fraud, and fraudulent use of personal information. Felony charges, all of them. His public defender tried to negotiate, I was told, but the evidence was overwhelming. The IP address logs, the phone records, the social media timeline. The fact that he had been living in an apartment opened in my name, driving a car financed in my name, while sitting 2 cubicles away from me asking if there was anything he could do to help. He pleaded guilty about 4 months after his arrest. He was sentenced to 4 years in state prison, plus restitution, meaning he was legally ordered to pay back the total fraudulent debt that had been accumulated in my name. Whether I'll ever see that money in full, I honestly don't know. But the conviction itself mattered to me more than the money. I needed the record to reflect what actually happened. The credit recovery process took another 1.5 years beyond that. Even with a police report, a conviction, and official documentation of every fraudulent account, getting credit bureaus to remove items is a slow, bureaucratic, often maddening process. You dispute. You wait. You follow up. You dispute again. There were accounts that took 3 separate rounds of disputes before they were finally removed. My credit score climbed back slowly, like a plant growing toward a window.
so gradual you almost don't notice it, until one day you look and realize the number on the screen looks different than you remember. By late 2024, my credit score was back in the low 700s. Not quite where it had been before all of this started, but close. Getting there. I got approved for an apartment, a nicer one than the one I'd been denied for at the lowest point of all of this.
When I signed the lease, I sat in my car in the parking lot for about 10 minutes before going in. Not because I was emotional, exactly, but because I just needed a moment to feel the weight of how long it had taken to get back to something as simple and normal as signing a lease for a place to live. I've thought a lot about why R did this. I've turned it over in my head probably more than is healthy. What I've come to is that I don't think there was one single answer. I think he was in financial trouble of his own. That came out during the investigation. He had significant debt and a gambling problem that nobody at work knew about. I think he saw an opportunity in the information I'd casually given him over lunches and vent sessions. My divorce, my financial stress, the fact that I was distracted and overwhelmed and probably not checking my credit report as closely as I should have been. I think he convinced himself, the way people do when they want to do something they know is wrong, that I'd figure it out eventually and it would get sorted out and the real harm would be minimal. The real harm was not minimal. But here's what I want to say to anyone reading this who is going through something similar, or who is at the beginning of that terrible process of figuring out that their identity has been compromised. Document everything. I mean everything. Every phone call. Write down the date, the time, the name of the rep you spoke to, and what was said. Every letter. Scan it. Keep a physical copy. Keep a digital backup. Every account on your credit report that you don't recognize, request the full account opening documents. You're legally entitled to them as a victim. Look at the email addresses, the phone numbers, the IP addresses if you can get them. Look at the dates. Build your own timeline, because nobody else is going to build it for you. Not the banks, not the credit bureaus, and in the early stages, often not even the police. Freeze your credit. All 3 bureaus. Equifax, Experian, TransUnion. Do it now, honestly, even if nothing has happened yet. It costs nothing, and it is the single most effective thing you can do to prevent new fraudulent accounts from being opened in your name. I wish I had done it years before any of this started. And I know this one is hard, but be careful what you share, and with whom. Not in a paranoid way, not in a way that makes you stop trusting people altogether, but in a thoughtful way. The information that R used to target me wasn't dramatic. It wasn't passwords or bank account numbers. It was the ordinary stuff. My divorce, my financial stress, probably my date of birth, which I'd mentioned once in the context of some work birthday thing. The last 4 of my social, which I may have mentioned in a completely innocent context at some point without even remembering it. Small things. Ordinary things. In the wrong hands, they become the building blocks of someone else's access to your entire financial life. I don't tell this story to make people paranoid. I tell it because for a long time, I thought identity theft was something that happened through massive data breaches or sophisticated hacking operations. I thought it was random and anonymous, and therefore sort of inevitable and sort of unpreventable. I didn't think it could be this personal, this close, this patient. It can be. The guy who destroyed 2 years of my life sat 2 cubicles away from me. He knew my name, my face, my birthday, my struggles. He asked me how I was doing while he was doing it. And he almost got away with it because I kept looking outward for the source of my problems instead of looking at what was right in front of me the entire time. I'm okay now. It took a long time to say that and actually mean it. But I do mean it. I'm okay. I have my credit back, I have my apartment, I have my life back in a form I can recognize. And I have a folder, still sitting on a shelf in my home office, a lot thicker now than when I started it, that is a record of
every step of a fight I did not ask for and refused to lose. If you're in the middle of it right now, keep going. Document everything. Ask for the details. Build the timeline. It feels endless, I know, but it is not endless. There is a day on the other side of it where you sit in a parking lot and feel the weight of what you just survived. And you go inside and you sign your name, and it is your name again. Fully and completely yours. That day comes. I promise you it comes.